Hey, so I'm Guy Mackinnon-Little, an editor at Tank, and I'm joined today by Louis Rogers from MacBooks, who's a frequent collaborator around TANKtv stuff as well. And we've just been watching Aki Kaurismäki's 1989 film Leningrad, Cowboys, Go America, which sort of follows this kind of Soviet kind of unclassifiable band, really, with these like epic hairstyles who decide to, follow their dreams and make it big in America. And it's this kind of satirical pantomime about everything, really. Louis, what were your kind of like initial impressions, maybe just to get started?
A good question. My first impressions on at the start of the film were very much those hairstyles you just mentioned,
Mm,
and the shoes they wear, and it's kind of like hyper stylized from the off, and in a way which I like, but also puts you a bit, or puts me at least, on a kind of funny edge because I'm kind of like, okay, where are we in this film? Sort of what am I in a way I really like. What's my response supposed to be to these things? Is it a kind of, is this going to be the kind of tenor of the jokes, or am I
mm,
like, almost reminded me the start of a kind of a Razorhead, for example, which I saw probably because I saw that not so long ago. But it's got this weird, like, the stylization is a bit weird, and I'm kind of like, where am I supposed to be? But then yeah, then it kind of unfolds into this nicely surprising kind of, almost like slightly sprawling road trip, which sits against the kind of funny tightness of the stylization of the
mm.
central characters, who are these this band, like quite a big band, I guess, sort of like polka music, is it? Like
Yes,
Russian.
something like that.
Yeah, yeah. But then it kind of plays out against a kind of quite, I guess, like as opposed to that broadly sort of realist and kind of like nicely relaxed kind of set of backgrounds in the United States. There's a couple of kind of wacky characters, but I think what really struck me for the most part was the way you had these kind of weird, this kind of crazy kooky band, and then these like lovely kind of tableau of just kind of like normal life, also in quite like out of the way, not particularly specified, like funny little corners of, I suppose, the southern United States. Do you know what I mean? It's not
Mm,
like doing that thing of playing in front of every big landmark or kind of central place in the US. It's kind of a funny, a real like peripheral United States they play through, and then end up at a wedding in Mexico. And so yeah, I think it was that um, like juxtaposition that
mm.
really kind of made characterized it for me in the end.
And those two things interact in a very interesting way, right? Where there's this tension between the extreme stylization and kind of overt ridiculousness of the film in terms of the characters' costumes, and as you said, their ridiculously long shoes and hairstyles, and kind of um, there's zero regard for realism in a certain sense. I mean, a character comes back from the dead at one point at the end, and it's this kind of almost parody of like the kind of excess and fantasy of rock and roll on a certain level. But then none of the characters in the surrounding world seem particularly phased by that at any point. There's a kind of weightlessness to it where it's like, oh, they got arrested for making a racket while they're trying to do this funeral march, but then they just go to jail for 3 days and then it's done and they're let free. There's this kind of relentless kind of like inertia to the film, like, okay, the show must go on, this must happen, everything must like happen. um yeah, it's a classic kind of road trip trope, I guess, if you're just being pulled towards this thing inexorably. And I also like what you said there about the kind of generic quality of the landscape they're in, where if you kind of think about American road film, or just band tour film in general as a kind of broader genre, it's this supercut of like the Statue of Liberty and like the Golden Gate Bridge and like that sort of thing as to kind of signify this thing passing. And there's this trope of, oh, they're coming from this, backwards, then not, I guess it would still be Soviet country, um, in the middle of nowhere, and then they go to America and find themselves in the middle of nowhere. And I
Yeah, yeah,
quite liked my expectations kind of going into the film is that it's released in 1989. It's an overt response to the waning power of the Soviet Union. The band itself was first conceived as a kind of parody in 1986, so that would have been right in the midst of these kind of like this like kind of slow melt of Soviet power, and it avoids feeling overtly political or like any kind of crude, overly literal kind of parable at any point, which I really enjoyed. Where I kept being like, oh, it's like there's the cruel band leader who's taking advantage of the bandmates, and that's going to be some kind of commentary on this or that. But it's just like, it kind of resists that, and it's just goofy and fun and awkward at every turn. And I think that awkwardness is kind of the central, feels like the central cog of the film, even something as simple as like just the misfit between the kind of broader context and the characters that you're mentioning earlier. Like, I remember there's a great scene where they get in the car and the band member who's driving them all has these ridiculous kind of super long pointy shoes, and he has to pin them back with a little like nail, and like that kind of clumsy but kind of tactful, deliberate sense of how we're going to make this all fit together feels like something that really pulls the film together. Especially when you think about the kind of the context of music as it's typically imagined in discourses around, you know, like globalism and, you know, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Specifically, if you think about trips around like techno in Berlin and like East and West Berlin, and music bringing people together and song and dance. I mean, like even when people talk about like sing Kumbaya around the fire, there's this trope of like music as this grand cultural unifier or universal language, and that's kind of resisted at every turn here, which I really liked.
For sure, yeah. It's kind of like you feel them kind of almost, they kind of go through the motions of the, I guess, well, we're talking about this in the context of ritual as well. It's almost like there's the kind of ritual or trope or scheme of the road movie, which, like you say, they just kind of, again, like they sort of move through it with this kind of weirdly implacable force. Like there are no kind of real, I mean, usually you'd have some kind of like more kind of bumps along the way, which they kind of are, but they sort of don't really pose any problems. They're just kind of like plowing through their episodes. And then there's the sort of other ritual trope of the like concert as a kind of moment, which I like you're just saying, it sort of resists being a sort of big epiphany moment or a big kind of, I mean, there are like small like crises, or there are concerts that kind of go terribly, and but then there's a concert that goes terribly and they're sort of like paid and then kind of asked in like fairly politely to never come back. It's like fair enough. And then there's also a concert that sort of seems to go really well in, I think in New Orleans or in the South, where the audience are kind of loving it, but they're not. It's not like that was an incredible moment. It's like similarly kind of underplayed, and it's quite like there's a surprising kind of sweetness almost to that like interaction of these like slightly lower key meetings of the like the strangeness, the normalness, and also these two sets of characters and the kind of east-west thing. Just as you say, it's not like never played for this kind of like overt moment. It kind of just
and it's never linear either. It's sort of it's, as you said, they have this like amazing performance in New Orleans, and there's a grand reception, and then later on it kind of goes back down, and what you're kind of expecting as the film goes along is that, oh, they bought this book on rock and roll, they're going to learn how to be a rock and roll band, and it's going to be this kind of in this exploration of assimilation and cultural identity and all those things, and it kind of is that, but it resists being this kind of like slow fade from one to another. Like the band isn't Americanized at any point. There's this constant kind of, which I guess is maybe says something about, and also so something to keep in mind as well is that the band themselves are Finnish. So it's this Finnish band role playing as like this Soviet polka band going to America. So there's like 3 degrees of like kind of removal in this whole thing. And there's never this kind of thing of like what the band is becoming. The band is just this modular thing which can do anything and become anything and adapt to anything. And I think that's kind of I don't think it's a film about that, but it did make me think about that, like the structure of like assimilation in general as being this kind of constant, unsteady, ongoing process where at one stage it's beneficial for them to like overperform how kooky and weird they are, and then at other stages it's kind of to their advantage to pull out their American cousin and just go straight rock and roll with a nice like American accent fronted lead singer. And it also says something about maybe like music in general in an American context and how it relies on this importation of exotic elements, and how that's been the kind of driving force in a lot of American 20th century music, I think. If you look at things like, I mean, straightforwardly with like jazz and blues and rock, and then more recently, I suppose, things like exotica and this kind of this vague, placeless, exotic kind of element. I mean, I think it's not for nothing that their first gig is they meet with this manager at, I think it's CBGB's actually in New York, and he's like, "Oh, I'll book you for like Madison Square Garden or whatever, and I'll get you these huge gigs." And he hears them playing. He's like, "Right, Mexico," and obviously Mexico is not in any way continuous with this, but it's like, "Yeah, you'll fit for Mexico," and that's kind of fun. but all these things are always left at the level of being kind of fun suggestions to the audience rather than being something that's explicitly spelled out as a kind of like, oh, this is a film to teach you something about X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Like it was really committed to just being a fun road film, but not losing substance for the at the expense of that.
Yeah, definitely. That also, like, part of that a lot feels, or a big part of that to me feels, just the way that they are able to play all these songs in like kind of different modes and different like context, whatever, just like at the drop of a hat. We don't like, there's a bit of like them strumming away, but there's no like rehearsal that we're seeing. They just seem to be able to kind of miraculously pull out like a kind of mariachi song in Mexico and like a different song in New Orleans, and then like do a kind of rock and roll. And there's something quite nice about the way it's just like there's kind of this completely unlabored way that they can just like produce, and it's not like quite right. It's not like a perfect rock and roll song, and I don't think, at least me watching it, you don't watch it, you're like, wow, this is an amazing band. It still has a kind of slightly, but they are like very, very slick and accomplished in a way which is quite satisfying, I think, as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think and then it's because it's kind of like there's that, and there's a contrast between that and then the kind of the clunkiness or clumsiness that otherwise pervades the film. So there's a scene which maybe is a good pairing for that, where they're all standing around and they're kind of the lead or the head of the band or the manager. It's not quite specified what his role is exactly, if I remember, or maybe I missed it. But there's this guy Vladimir who's kind of the the one who like takes the money and organizes the show and does all that. And he's like, okay, you need to learn rock and roll, and he hands them all a songbook, and you see all like the whole band kind of take up the whole screen as this kind of comic entity trying to read this book at once. And that's obviously just like total dysfunction. But then there's a contrast between that and the ease which they perform, and that kind of the film seems to like really just amplify that paradox just for the sake of it as a kind of fun device at all times, where it's constant, nothing's working and everything just miraculously works at any given moment, and you're never quite, and it's not always apparent which one you're seeing, whether you're seeing the clunky collapse or you're seeing the kind of miraculous coming together of something. And it never switches over from one to the other. It's this constant tug between the two, and I found that really pleasurable to watch, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that really speaks to, I think, my whole experience of the film, because it's also that you never quite, maybe this is what I was trying to describe at the start of it, you're not quite like certain whether you're being pulled into a really kind of arch, do you know what I mean, constructed world, or a kind of, I don't know, something much more familiar. You see what I mean? It kind of holds you holds you between them in a way which is really rare, I think.
And it kind of forcefully pulls you into the clumsiness of the film then as well, where you're constantly trying to like figure out, they're in this context moving around America, where they're constantly trying to figure out, what are the expectations, what am I supposed to be doing, what's the correct way of doing this, etc., etc. And then as a viewer, you're kind of like, what are they doing, how am I supposed to be responding to it, like what are the kind of the tropes and ideas that I'm familiar with that I should be using to read and pass this film. And
like, how do I assimilate myself to this kind of like
exactly
comedy or something?
yeah I really loved it. And if there's any like scene or idea that's maybe good to end on in particular.
I think, well, what are the other really strong moments? I mean, one thing that we haven't mentioned, which feels, I don't know, indicative of, like, plays into a lot of them, and there's also these intertitles that run through the whole film and sort of end it in this kind of typically like, well, it's almost like, it feels like it's going to end on one intertitle and then it ends on like three intertitles or titles at the end. It's just like kind of finishing you off with it, kind of really, and then just like, and then they got into the top 10 in Mexico. It's like, great. But these kind of titles are like pushing you through the story the whole way through, also kind of pulling back in a way, because they have a funny like dissonance to them, the tone of them or something. And similarly have a kind of even almost the voice of them is hard to judge, in the same way that the film kind of has a funny like wry reticence that you don't quite know.
It's this constant play with genre and form and expectations that kind of keeps going. Thanks so much for talking. It was really, really good. I really enjoyed it. And I apparently the band is still touring today.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they kind of became a novelty act after the film was born,
Yeah.
and
Wow.
they're still going. I'm not sure what they're up to. I guess they're somewhere in Mexico.
Probably are playing weddings, to be honest.
I'd book them.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Cheers, Louis.
Great. Thanks a lot, Guy. Good to talk.